sports show, bringing you all the news from the local area and around the world. And we're very fortunate in this show to bring you guests from all range of disciplines in sports, world's best athletes, sports people, trainers, coaches, many things related to sport, some fascinating insights to different roles and people who walk around the world as well. And our segment also we do on speaking to people in the field of psychology, some of the most well-known, most influential psychologists around the world, giving us insight into their research and their ideas in the field as well. Today we have a very special guest who's going to give us insight into her role. No doubt it'll be quite fascinating. I mean, looking forward to interviewing our guest that we have this evening, who is an Academy Scout at Manchester United, and also I'm sure she'll be able to explain better than me her research, which is performance-based as well. Danielle Prescott, welcome to the show. Great to have you on board.
Thanks a lot, Jimmy. It's really nice to have me.
Yeah, no, it's great to have you on board, and I suppose our listeners will be wondering, what does an Academy Scout, what does that involve? I'm sure there's loads of people listening who are probably wondering if there's an opportunity for them to be seen, but more to the point, what does an Academy Scout do, Danielle?
Basically, it can depend largely on kind of what your role is within that academy. So it could be anything from grassroots football to academy-based football. So I tend to sit with Manchester United on the pro academy side, which basically means that I would visit the academy setups for the region that I'm designated with, and then I would cover specific age groups that I've been tasked with, really. So for me personally, I look from anything from under 12s right to under 23s. So it's quite a big breadth of having to switch quite quickly from the types of things that you're looking for at a very young age to potentially people that are just on the cusp of making it to that first team senior level. So it is quite a very fast pace, and it can literally be that in the morning I'm at a young game, and then later on that evening I'm at an under 23s game. So it is very quick, and just switching of the mindset, really, for me personally.
No, interesting stuff. So that sort of rules me out then. I was going to put the boots back on and see if I could talk into, so I'm just slightly over that age range, I'm afraid. But I suppose, interestingly enough, what do you look for, Danielle? What do you look for in a player? Is there a criteria that you guys work on, or what generally is it? Intuition? Is it a combination of things? What do you look for in a player potentially?
I think it is a combination of many things. I mean, we do have set criteria at Manchester United, but I can't necessarily divulge or go into too much.
Yeah.
But I think depending on kind of at what age they're at is a big factor as well. So there's got to be that understanding that at 11, 12 years old, the kind of the developmental side of the game and the awareness of it might not quite be there. So you're looking for things that you would be expecting of that age group, with the view that hopefully they will, as they mature, things will change. Whereas at under 23s, you're kind of hoping that they're ready to go. So anything that you kind of see as faults at under 23s isn't necessarily a good thing. But at the same time, you can get a lot of young players that play in under 23 sides. So that in itself can kind of be a bit of an indicator in terms of their personal development and how they are being perceived at the club that they are part of, in terms of being given that opportunity, really, to be on the cusp of that first team.
Yeah, interesting you say, and I suppose the age group you work with is really interesting. And the reason I say that is because obviously in the UK we have the academy or centre of excellence system where they get to an age where they get to like a transitional age. I know some clubs have got the under 23s as well, but the point I'm trying to make is that physical maturation, and I suppose mental maturation as well too, you could argue, doesn't happen till maybe mid 20s. Maybe physical maturation a little bit less, but is that something you've got to take in consideration, where for example you might have a 17, 18 year old who's been released from a football club, but not so much on their ability to play, maybe just physically they haven't matured at the same level as everybody else?
Yeah, definitely, and there's actually plenty of research in. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the relative age effect and the research around that, in terms of the expectation that people are supposed to develop at certain stages, and the thing is, we're all different. So kind of putting a one-size-fits-all approach isn't necessarily the right thing to do.
Yeah.
But probably like Messi's probably the perfect example.
Exactly,
you know,
yeah.
got kind of fobbed off many times because of his size, and he's not necessarily, you know, big now really, but he's obviously one of the, if not the greatest player in the world. So it kind of shows you that knocking people for things like that can actually be really detrimental to the club. But I think something that we have to kind of be aware of within our system here in England or the UK is that because it's seen as a very prestigious type environment, it attracts worldwide attention. So obviously they get people from overseas. And when we see, you know, players coming in from, you know, from places like Africa and Nigeria, there's a lot of kind of speculation around, obviously, the recording of their birthdays. And how that's recorded. So you can see an under-14s team, and then there's a Nigerian player that's come in, and he kind of overshadows the whole team, and you kind of question, you know, is he really 14? And you have to go off obviously what's been recorded in his home country, and that's not necessarily reflective of how he would have been recorded here. He was born here, so there's all those factors as well. Yeah,
that's a great point you've made, and certainly, you know, I suppose in saying that, I mean, this is sort of, I suppose, outside the scope of your remit and maybe research as well. My understanding is that in some situations they've done, this is not really my area either, so I'm sort of treading new water, but I'm sort of aware of clubs sometimes looking at like bone density tests and otherwise, which might be unethical too as well, but sort of, is that something that you've ever sort of heard of yourself as well, Danielle, where clubs have sort of maybe, you know, speculated about age and looked into it more deeper?
Yeah, I think it's fair to, obviously, if it's a safe scientific procedure that's not, you know, not invasive really in any way, and I think a lot of clubs do have that luxury of the sports science, you know, departments that are inbuilt into the academies now, and you can use those sort of measures to get a bit of an indication in terms of how a player is expected to physically develop. And a lot of that is obviously through those tests, but there's also the element of, you know, the background history. So what does that player's parents, what are their heights like, and the genetics factor is put in as well.
Yes, no, really interesting stuff, and obviously, you know, like he says there, sort of, you know, age obviously, I suppose at specific points. Do you think age has a big impact on development at certain group? I mean, like for example, so if you took, say, a teen, like maybe a 14, 15-year-old is going to be far more developed than, say, an 11-year-old, but you might have like an 18-year-old that's sort of, you know, things. Is there a point where things sort of even themselves out, do you think, Danielle, more so in age, or do you think that generally speaking it follows a linear process?
Personally speaking, I think there is a lot of change happening in regards to how people perceive that. Because this is what I mentioned before about the relative age effect. That's kind of where that sits. So the example of that is, you know, essentially people that are. So the relative age effect explains 4 quartiles. So you've got quartile 1, which is September through to November, I think it is, or December, and basically those quartiles spread every 3 months throughout the year. So if you're in quartile 4, which is essentially classed as June, July and August, you're seen as being at a disadvantage, and that's purely based on our academic years here, because you essentially are the youngest person in your school year.
Interesting,
So you've essentially got, you might have I don't know, let's say a year 7 student over here in the UK, which is around age 11 or 12. The difference between the people that were born in August compared to the people that were born in September, but yet are in the same academic year, can be massively different. But yet they will be put into the same potential group in terms of sport.
Of course, I mean, it's a difficult one, obviously, logistically, to make it an even playing field, one would think, and I suppose that's something we can touch on at some point, but I think it's really interesting stuff you mentioned there. I think one of the things I was sort of thinking too, Danielle, was like, for example, like, I mean, some maybe listeners can sort of relate to this example too, like, say, for example, we remember Wayne Rooney when he sort of burst on the scene, and, you know, physically he was, you know, developed But then if you maybe take, not that I sort of know any of these players personally or aware of where they were at their age group, maybe like a Vardy, for example, who went into non-league, who may not have been as physically as developed as Rooney, but made his way back in. So what I'm sort of saying there is that, is there potential for players to be released? Maybe it's changed now, but certainly I can remember a time in the UK where physical attributes were sort of taking a big priority. You mentioned Messi, that was a classic example. The big question is, what do you think? What are your thoughts, Danielle? Would Messi, do you think, have been scouted in the UK? I know it's a difficult one for you to answer, but is he just that talented? But are we missing people like that, do you think?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I personally think that's an old way of looking at players. So I think,
yeah,
I when I go to games, you still chat to other scouts, and they do comment on physicality of players,
yes,
and all of that sort of obvious thing that's in front of you. But there are a lot more things now that kind of outweigh that. So people's kind of creativity within the game, and the technical and the tactical ability, and kind of even the discipline, and that's probably one of the most important things that I've maybe took from working with United, is that we're looking for things that are untrainable, and that's because they'll be natural within that person. So we don't necessarily want to get players that are really difficult to work with, because that makes everybody's life really difficult.
Yeah.
So I think kind of trying to find that within someone within the game of football can be quite difficult at times, but you can see snippets of it in terms of the discipline, and when things don't quite go their way, how do they deal with it?
Yes, the attitude, yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you can have the most talent in the world, one could argue, but if you haven't got the right attitude, you probably aren't going to get. When I say attitude, I know it's broadly speaking and abstract, but that desire, that want to be as well, which is sort of key factors there. I mean, what interests me about the work you do, I think what's really fascinating and great, you've obviously got an academic background as well, and tell us a bit about your academia, how that sort of has an impact in what you do as well, Danielle. I think that's really important. Yeah.
It has a massive impact, and they work very well together. So the types of things that I do away from academia, I very much bring into the classroom. And then obviously the readings that I have to do to be able to teach kind of impacts on my thoughts going back out into the field. So it's kind of a figure of 8 type scenario, really, where it all kind of interlinks. But I'm personally one of the types of people that would rather kind of be out there practicing and then bring that into the classroom and kind of educate based on experiences and what's really happening in the field, rather than learning just off the experience of potentially just research and academia within the field, but an actual just something that's I don't quite know how to describe it, but something first-hand experience, I suppose.
Yeah, and absolutely. And in terms of yourself, I mean, what was your motivation to do scouting? I mean, I no doubt it's an enjoyable role, a fascinating role, demanding role. But what was it? What inspired you to go down that road, Danielle, to be a scout?
To be honest, it was kind of a natural progression. So prior to moving into more of a scouting role, I worked for a couple of clubs in performance analysis. So I kind of did that throughout my education at degree level, and I was fortunate enough to be able to kind of carry on alongside my academic career with all of that. And then it just got to a point where I kind of realised that there are a lot of skills within that actually you can transition through to scouting and recruitment, and the observation skills and looking for weaknesses, identifying strengths.
Absolutely,
and rather than it always being team focused, you can actually use that from a recruitment perspective and identifying individuals. So that's kind of the natural progression that I took, really, and was fortunate to be able to do, and it was completely unplanned.
Yeah.
But I think the exposure that I've had at different levels of clubs, so that's been from League One, Championship and Premier League clubs, has just kind of paved the way, really, in terms of, I suppose, widening my skills in terms of what I can look for, and utilising my academic background and how I kind of present myself, etc., and being able to kind of be in that environment, because a lot of people think it is just skill driven, but you've got to kind of I think be quite thick-skinned as well to be in that sort of elite football world in particular.
Absolutely, no, I completely agree, and that's a conversation I've had with many people in the area. It's a tough industry, a lot of pressure, and I suppose in one sense, say for example, you've got a manager of a football club, and they need. If you're a first team manager, Danielle, the reality is, how much time do you have to develop a player? Do you go and buy one? And it's a balance. Do you not think that has an impact on your work as well?
It does, and it's. I mean, if I kind of take me out of the equation from a manager perspective, it's a hell of a lot of pressure, and the reason for that is because it's not a pressure that sometimes you're not given the luxury of time. It's very much it's got to be quick. It's got to be a quick turnaround, and it's all about results. And some people don't work as quickly as that, and trying to convince people that they do need more time and it is more developmental can be quite a difficult thing, and you're judged sometimes off the immediate, and how that can subsequently then have an impact on someone like myself is that if you were brought in with that manager, you could be gone essentially. So it's it's sometimes football is a very fickle world, and your connections are crucial, really.
Yeah, and absolutely, and I think it's one of them really. The reality is that on the other side of things, that we all, I suppose, in one sense, like to believe that we have this ability as a footballer too. And certainly in my experience in the game, this is not, I think for the most part, people sort of have an idea where they stand. But in all truthfulness, this is my perception, Danielle. There are people who do have that confirmation bias. I've sort of spoken to many parents who probably think with all the will in the world their child is I had people sending in emails and stuff like that and describe their play, and I'm thinking, well, if they meet those sort of credentials, they should be playing for the biggest club in the world somewhere. But do you not find that sometimes there is that bit of confirmation bias? We sort of see what we want to see, but the reality is football's a tough sport to make it in.
Yeah, I think to be honest, I think that's kind of what makes us humans, isn't it? We kind of invest in something sometimes, and when we do that, we always want the best for that thing or that person, whatever it is that we invest in. So it's kind of inevitable, really. And I think it does happen, in the scouting world. Especially if you're sent to watch a particular player X amount of times, and it's always a good experience with that particular scouting request that you've been given. So you kind of want the best for that player, because even though your level of investment is purely, well, I've only been to watch them maybe 10 times this season, but every single time has been a good one. You kind of have that level of investment where you want them to do well, and whether that's for the club you work for or another club, really. But it's quite a difficult one, because you obviously want people to do well, but you also want to be very realistic in terms of the levels that people are at. Absolutely,
and I think as well, in terms of yourself, I mean, from the point of view of, there's the other side of things too, where as a scout, I suppose there is that pressure to make sure that the players you are scouting are of a certain level. It's like, it's a difficult one, isn't it, really, in the sense that, there is that bit of pressure where if you're recommending players, then they've got to be at a certain level as well. Does that sort of play on your mind too, where you sort of want to maintain, the benchmark, and you've got to do your best to adhere to that?
Yeah, it does a little bit, and I think we've got a very good system at United, where we've kind of got the reassurances and the opinions of many different people. So if I saw a particular player that I wanted to report in on and had quite a strong opinion on, then what would happen is they would send someone else out to go and view it and see what their opinion was, and it's quite a very good regime, really, in terms of what we've got. But it kind of gives you that bit of security that it would be quite nice to kind of get the same input from someone else. But if it's not, then it could be that maybe that player was just having a very good game, or that everybody else was having a very bad one. So it's the way in which we structured it, I think, is very good, and it does take a little bit of pressure off, because it's not kind of solely your decision, which is good. But I think we're there potentially to to also watch the development of players. It's not just about picking players up as soon as we see something, spectacular, because it could be a one-off. It could
Absolutely,
be a fluke, and it's not about racing in and trying to get that player straight away, but it's about monitoring them and just seeing how they actually progress.
Definitely seeing them live as well. I mean, people send in show reels sometimes. I've seen show reels, Danielle, where you look at the players' best moments and you think, wow, then they come into training and the reality is they just might not meet the intensity for that level as well. So
the problem with that is they sent you a real called best moment.
Yes.
So
I'm pretty sure I could send one of them in as well, and I think we all can to a point.
Well, exactly, yeah.
So over time, exactly, but also over time too. Are you looking for other things too? Possibly, how they handle. I mean, there's the old cliche we've all heard before. I mean, in the nice summer months, the weather's been beautiful, for example, and in a nice August or September, even October. The pitch is nice, but then the old cliche, December, January, and do you sort of look at that too in terms of how they handle different sort of situations as well?
Yeah, different environments.
Yeah.
We part of our reporting process is looking at obviously what the situation is at the time and how they perform, because you can, it's quite a tough discipline to be part of, really, because the one wrong thing that you could say can make or break a person's career, and
Absolutely.
Regardless of whether that's so young or kind of getting to that senior point in their career, but they have to take all those factors into account. So if it's a very poor day in terms of weather, which is making play very difficult, and the score line and the performance isn't quite reflective of what's actually gone on, then of course we need to take that into account, and we'll probably just go and revisit them again and hope for better conditions, but we just keep going until obviously we got an accurate picture of that person.
Yeah, and I suppose this day and age with technology and the world being a smaller place in one sense, in terms of how we can sort of manoeuvre and watch and other forms of very rarely, I think, not as often people do slip the net. Where do you find that with obviously people like yourself who've got real good performance knowledge, and no doubt I don't want to sort of, I don't disclose what methods you use, but my experience of speaking to scouts where they might use things like technology to look into the game in general, performances, and a lot of statistics these days we can use too. But do you find that makes it less and less slip the net? Like maybe in the past you might have a few more people slipping the net and sort of going on and they weren't picked up?
I think that's a tough one, because I think statistics and online footage can often be used and relied upon maybe too much.
Yeah, good point,
Yeah, I've kind of heard things in the past where whole departments have based their whole recruitment strategy on statistics.
Exactly.
But it's and if that's the way they're going, I suppose the crucial thing is if that works, then
you like to film Moneyball, exactly,
But more often than not, for me personally, and that is an area that I actually teach in within academia anyway, that statistics are there to kind of to back up what you think of that player and to try and make valid cases for players rather than being the sole purpose as to why you would recruit someone. Yeah,
and that's a great point. And I think, like you says there, it's like combining all elements really. And I mean, I sort of heard one time I was at a conference, a club that was going to go down that road in a recruitment, and you just sort of get the feel where I think the eye, the sort of the naked eye, so to speak, our sort of ability to be in tune is, and it's hard to consider certain variables, Danielle, as well in stats, what impact they have on the dressing room, on other players, and all these other things too, I think. But you're better placed on that than me, really. But yeah, no, it's sort of fascinating speaking to you. Sort of mindful of time, be very kind to sort of join us. I'm sure everyone's sort of glued to the radio, listening in, wondering. But in terms of yourself, sort of moving forward, obviously, the scouting and sort of it's more of the same. Carry on and see what happens. I suppose your objective is to sort of keep doing what you're doing.
It's exactly that. Keep doing what we're doing, but at the moment, because of obviously our restrictions and the ever-changing environment that seems to be on a weekly basis at the moment, we're just kind of waiting. And I personally haven't been to a game since March, so it's a bit of a tough time and very abnormal, because we would kind of work at games all year round, so it's very different to have such a big period where you've got no football involvement at all.
Yes, absolutely. I can imagine. I was going to say that I was going to sort of offer an open invitation to one of the clubs I'm helping at the moment, Baker, but I'm not sure if the manager will receive that well. You're taking about players, and mind you, the manager's amazing, and he always wants the best for players, and I think that's a big thing too as well. I think in terms of, do you find that sort of on a final, like the relationship with managers is really important, Danielle, to have? Or coaches in general, like scouting and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, it's very much an interdisciplinary approach, really. So you as much as you kind of feel that you've got one role and they've got another one, you kind of can't do a complete job without the involvement of everybody. So keeping those connections alive and making sure that you treat everybody with respect, of course, but just making sure that those connections are always active. And the thing is, this is something that I say to students all the time, you never know who you're going to be working with in the future.
Good point.
And you should, that's why you should always kind of make sure that you're open to making connections, and because you never know, they could be the person that actually gets you through that door that you want to get through. So
absolutely.
It's crucial to keep those relationships.
Yeah, that's a great point, and certainly echo those sentiments. I think it's really, and for life in general too, I think it makes the world a better place in terms of people having life skills too. You can transfer that life skill wherever you go. It's been really fascinating, Danielle. I've been really grateful to come on board the show, and that our listeners have really enjoyed it. So I want to thank you again for coming on board. And
well, thank you for asking me. It's been perfect.
Thank you, Danielle. That was Danielle Prescott, Academy Scout at Manchester United. Really fascinating insight into what she does, and really, really interesting stuff. So, as always, feel free to drop us an email on our Facebook page, the Friday Sports Show on 94.4FM Salford City Radio with your host, Jimmy Petruzzi. Thanks for listening. You're listening to 94.4FM Salford City Radio, the Friday Sports Show with your host, Jimmy Petruzzi, bringing you all the news from the local area and around the world. And we're very fortunate show to have a wide range of guests, many guests from different areas in sport. We've spoken to some of the world's best athletes, footballers, trainers, coaches, people who work in different capacities in sport as well, different levels as well. Our segment, which is not so new now, we've interviewed some of the most influential people in the world of psychology. We've given us an insight into their research, what they do across a broad range of areas in related fields. And today we have an expert, fantastic expert, coming on board the show, a really, really relevant area in sport and in general at the moment, our minds. So we're going to get a really, really fascinating insight in terms of the world of sports psych. We've got Dr. Amy Whitehead. She's a reader of sports psychology and coaching at Liverpool John Moores University. Welcome to the show, Amy. Great to have you on board.
Thanks for having me on, Jamie.
Now, it's really interesting what you do, and I know that you can explain to the listeners a bit more what you do. But let's sort of start from the beginning. What sort of got you into doing what you do, sports psych? What was your sort of motivation, Amy?
Yeah, I think for me, as a young athlete myself, I was a tennis player as a junior, and kind of on to other sports kind of as I've got older. But I think combining like psychology and sport has always been a big interest to me. Sports psychology, when I first started studying like 14 years ago, was a very new kind of topic area and something that wasn't maybe taken as seriously. And it's been really great to see over the last 10, 12, 14 years about how sports psychology has grown, and people recognise sports psychology as a relevant and very important discipline.
Yes.
And it's combining the love of sport and being able to help people. That was my main motivation.
And obviously you've been successful in the area. You've worked with a lot of great people, athletes, teams, and sort of the research you've done as well. I mean, what about your research, just for our listeners to get an insight into what your area of research is, Amy?
Yeah, no problem. So my main area of research is looking at how people think, so how athletes think during performance. And I ask people to verbalise what they're thinking as they're doing. So they'll wear a clip mic and a dictaphone as they're performing, and they'll verbalise their thought process during performance, where possible, of course. If it's a team-based, quite fast-paced sport, it's quite difficult to do. But for example, in golf, I'll mic up golfers and ask them to verbalise their thought process as they play over a round, and then we can analyse that thought process and look at things like how they might cope under pressure, and differences between practice and competition, and then also looking at differences between experts and novices and how they think during performance.
I mean, I find that really fascinating, Amy. The reason being is that in sort of my experience, that's something I sort of suggested people do in, not obviously in the depths that you do, but just generally when people go to do presentations and they have like presentation anxiety or performance anxiety, maybe going to an interview and just in general life. Do you find, I know it's sort of outside the scope of our conversation, but do you find there's a case for maybe sort of externalizing and sort of verbalizing just things in general in terms of performance related, even outside sport?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just initially verbalising our thoughts as we're doing just makes us become more aware of some of them maybe less helpful thought processes that we might have, and by becoming aware of them we can then put in kind of some basic interventions to help us overcome them feelings of stress and anxiety. So from a sport perspective, during a high pressure situation, a golfer might start to overthink their performance and become quite internalised, so we can then ask them or support them in having more of an external focus, which then helps overcome these feelings of stress and anxiety. So yeah, you can apply that in, you just said there, doing a presentation or in a business situation, in a meeting, although it'd be difficult to verbalise your thoughts if you're leading a meeting. But
No, exactly, for sure. You might raise a few eyebrows there, but yeah, exactly. But interesting you say, I mean, is it, say, for example, kind of the gateway to our thoughts? I mean, as human beings we can speak and, obviously we can communicate through language. Is it sort of a gateway to one's sort of feelings and what's going on in the mind?
Yeah, I think so. From my perspective, I think it is one way of gaining a deeper understanding into our natural thought process. I think that sometimes if we think about reflection and even just memory, so how we remember something might be different to what actually happened during the event. So I think by verbalising it concurrently during the activity or the performance, we are capturing kind of real, live in the event thought processes that we might forget later on. However, sometimes we might not know why we do something, so that might be something for us to remember later on. But for me, there's a real advantage into tapping into that cognitive process during.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's definitely interesting, what you do, and when you mention interventions, are there any specific? I know it's only a short time, on the show. I'm sure that you can sort of, elaborate, but just sort of generally speaking, are there any sort of specific interventions that you can sort of mention? You're okay to mention in terms of what you might do if someone verbalizes their thoughts.
Yeah, I mean the potential is like endless. So with a golfer, for example, we will mic them up, ask them to verbalise their thought process, and then we'll use that as kind of a baseline measure to look at certain thought processes. So if they might not follow a pre-performance routine, and that might be something that we can identify through using Think Aloud, and then we can recommend that they follow a pre-performance routine to help them be more focused before each shot. So that's kind of one basic example of an intervention. There might be other kind of things that we might find out about an athlete through using Think Aloud, such as that they might react quite negatively or get quite upset with themselves after like losing a point in tennis, for example. So then you can put in kind of some calming strategies or interventions at them points and help the athlete to overcome coping with failure and dealing with certain reactions during performance.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of might be outside the scope of your research, but I'm just wondering in terms of language, if they sort of speak a different language, if that would have an impact in terms of in terms of what sort of is going on in obviously we have different ways of expressing ourselves through language, but do you find that if someone, for example, their first language is something different, let's say for example, Amy, the sort of a clear example would be, let's say you've got an athlete who's based in the UK but their first language might have been Spanish or something along them lines. Would it make a difference in terms of how they verbalise their thoughts, do you think? Or is that, I know it might be outside the scope, but just out of curiosity.
What if I was to ask them to verbalise in English?
Yeah, I mean, would they have a tendency possibly to maybe verbalise their first language, or would it?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting point. I've kind of supported research in other countries, and the question is, from a research perspective, do we ask them to verbalise in English or their native language? So my response to that would be in their native language, because to be able to verbalise, not your own thought process and then record it into English would be a kind of an extra level of effort. I think you're then making the whole process more complex for a person who's not a native English speaking person. So I'd always recommend verbalising in your first language.
So it makes it more natural as possible for them.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And in terms of you mentioned there, it was an interesting point you've mentioned there. Obviously, you sort of got into it, years ago, and you've seen changes. What sort of changes have you seen in terms of the acceptance of sports psychology over the years? What would you say has changed?
Yeah, huge acceptance. I think there's finally been kind of a recognition that the mental side of the game is hugely, hugely important, and I think professionalising sports psychology has made a huge difference. And now you see many, football, rugby, all different sports hiring, sports psychologists as key members of the sports science team. I do think, though, there's still work to be done. You always kind of see that the sports psychologist is either part-time or, just dipping in and out. There's less kind of full-time contracts. And some organisations I personally don't think pay or have a big enough salary for sports psychologists, because they'll compare them to, like, a physiotherapist, for example. You can see the physical kind of developments and changes and the work that they're doing with the athlete, and there's the argument with sports psychology, maybe you can't see it happen, so it's less important, which I completely disagree with. But I do think sports now, national governing bodies have take sports psychology so much more seriously than they did kind of 10, 12 years ago.
It's interesting you say that. I mean, the thing is, you can sort of, I guess you can quantify in one sense, say conditioning coach Amy comes into the club and the players are sort of, running under 3 seconds or 20 metres, or they're doing a VO2 max improvement or whatever. And I suppose as a variable, you can quantify it. I mean, have you got ways to sort of quantify what you do, other than obviously the person winning a tournament or playing better? But how do you have ways that you sort of quantify the impact that you've made, or I suppose the proof is in the person succeeding?
Yeah, I think that's quite a philosophical debate that we could have for a couple of hours. So within sports psychology, you could say, well, yeah, objectively, I've done this work with an athlete, they've improved performance, times, objective measures. But actually, also as a sports psychologist, our job is also, depending on which kind of philosophical approach you take, it might just be to improve that person's well-being, make them a more well-rounded person, and just make them happier. So I guess it depends on your stance as a sports psychologist, whether you're about developing the human first and then the performer, or vice versa. And for me personally, I think it's always both. If I'm working, with a sport performer in a specific sport, if they're hiring me as a sports psychologist, I'm there to help them with their performance, but I'm also there to hopefully make them a happier, healthier person. And the happy and healthy element is really hard to objectify and put a quantitative measure on. So yeah, I do think that
Yeah.
there are some measures you can use. So you just used an example there with the S&C coach, but what's to say that it was actually the sports psychologist that's
Absolutely.
made that person more motivated?
Precisely. Absolutely. I suppose there is that sort of physical element. I suppose it is a psychology in itself, where, for example, certain athletes they sort of quantify the quality of the session based on the intensity or how they feel afterwards. So that physical measure, in one sense. But I suppose everyone's different. I mean, you mentioned now obviously psychology sort of grown a lot, at least in sport, over the last few years. With that, there's been a lot of literature, a lot of information, a lot of people, mental skills and so on and so forth. I suppose in one sense, as an area, the regulations in terms of how one presents themselves differ, to the point that you can have people call themselves mind skills coaches, and I'm not sort of suggesting they do or don't do a good job. It is what it is. But my sort of thing is basically, for people sort of listening and thinking I want to get involved and work with someone to help improve my mind, what sort of should they look out for in terms of, do you think, I know it's a difficult question to answer, but what are some of the things to sort of take in consideration? Because people make claims, Amy, that they can do this, that and the other, but the reality is that, things aren't always as easy as that to improve. But do you find the area in itself with growth has also brought other problems as well?
Yeah, but I guess you have got the problems of people kind of claiming to be, sports psychologists without the qualifications. But I think over the years, the discipline itself has become a lot more kind of stringent and clear in terms of what a qualified sport and exercise psychologist is. So I think if you were, any of the listeners were thinking, right, how can I look for someone who is actually an accredited sport and exercise psychologist, I would say make sure they're HCPC registered. So on the HCPC website, there's you can search, you could just put my name in and my number will come up, and that means that I'm I'm accredited with the British Psychological Society. I've been through a rigorous qualification. I've got a PhD, I've got a master's, and I've got X amount of years of supervised experience. So it's kind of ticking all the boxes, and you are then insured via the HCPC and you're on their register. So I do think that so you can go by the British Psychological Society, or now BASES also do their CPAR route, which also gives you HCPC registration. So I'd make sure that if you are looking for a sports psychologist, make sure they have got a HCPC registration number.
Yeah, I mean that's the sort of thing, I suppose, this sort of that quality assurance. I'm sort of not sort of undermining people who have different entry points, who bring different skills to the party. I'm sure they can, mentors, people who've got different set of skills. But I think for me, there is that sort of fine line between, say, for example, it depends on what the person's looking for and what they're looking to do. One of the things I think, as an observation point of view from I suppose from the periphery, is that sort of fine line, Amy, between clinical and performance. And I've sort of mentioned this before, and I've sort of wrote an occasional article on it. I see it sometimes, and I've seen it in say, for example, health centres and PTs. Is where do you draw the line in terms of getting involved in say what probably is best a clinical issue? Do you find in sports psych there are issues that exist that might require clinical help in adverse to performance?
Definitely, yeah. And I think, so personally, I haven't had that much experience kind of working with athletes that need clinical support, but I've been on webinars and workshops and heard other sports psychologists talk about how they've had quite serious issues with or they've observed serious issues within athletes that they're working with that kind of sit outside of sports psychology. And for me, they do have a responsibility then to help that individual seek a clinical psychologist for additional support outside the realms of sports psychology. But there is a lot of discussion and debate around this issue at the minute. because we can't just as sports psychologists, we can't just dismiss someone's clinical issue. We have to, support them as much as we can. But yeah, it's really important that we do seek guidance and help, and we refer these athletes with clinical issues to other more qualified people.
Yeah, and I suppose on the other side of things, it could be like, for example, someone could have anxiety, but it might be like a biological issue where it could be like maybe a thyroid. Who knows? I'm not a medical person by any stretch of the imagination, but the point being is that I suppose it's having a good network of people. So, for example, the person might has suffered an adverse event, and that sort of sparked a clinical mood disorder. And so, what I'm getting at is really, in terms of having a network of people, do you think it's important to have a network for anyone sort of making their way in the field of people around them to understand how to refer and what to sort of take on and what their remit is?
Yeah, 100%, and I think that's a really good point you've just made in terms of having that network and being aware of, these other people in the field that can support that process if it came up. So, for example, within BASES we talk a lot about, clinical support and when to refer, and if you are a sports psychologist working in the field, then it would be really useful to be aware of local clinical psychologists that you can speak to and even seek advice from to see if your athlete does need that additional support.
Yeah, that's really interesting stuff, and no doubt our listeners who are contemplating going into the area of sports psych, that'll be very informative for them. Just sort of in terms of your own work, and what's your vision for your work? The work you've done is sort of great. It's out there, and I know that you're sort of going to keep going. And sort of, where do you see your work going from now, Amy? You've sort of seemed to have done a lot in the time you've been doing what you do, and sort of where do you sort of see the progression for you, or sort of what do you do? What's the next step for yourself?
Yeah, I think for me, with all of my research, it's how does it apply to real world practice. So. Yeah, I've developed or adapted a tool to look at athlete cognitions, and from a research perspective we can conclude a lot of different things from that, but then I want to look at how can that improve practice. So how can a sports psychologist now use Think Aloud as a tool to understand their athlete? So yeah, I think moving more towards the applied world of research, that's one avenue, and then I also do a lot of work with national governing bodies, with coaches, to look at how Think Aloud can be used as a coach from a reflective practice perspective. So they're constantly learning and reflecting as they're coaching.
And in terms of the research so far, obviously you've put a lot of work and effort into it. What's been sort of the most rewarding thing about the research that you've done up to now, Amy?
For me, I think it's been recognised by different national governing bodies and being invited to kind of present applied workshops and presentations, and being able to work with real life coaches. So being able to take, a piece of research that you spend a year, collecting data, writing it up, and then getting it published, to be able to then reapply that back into the real world of coaching, for me is the most rewarding thing. And being able to work with organisations like the English Football Association,
fantastic.
UK Coaching. For me, it's what I do it for.
Yeah, and I can imagine there's sort of people listening who are at that stage where they're doing research or contemplating it. I suppose what sort of strikes me there is that you've got very passionate about it, and it's something you really, really have a strong desire to do as well. And is that for any researcher? Because research is, at least for a lot of people, it's not easy. It's a lot of work to do. Is that what sort of keeps you motivated, or kept you motivated yourself to sort of carry on and keep going? Your desire and to create new ideas and new research and new innovations?
Yeah, I think everyone's different and everyone might have a different motivation. But for me, and especially working in the world of sport coaching and sports psychology, it's a very applied environment. So if the research we're doing doesn't apply to kind of the real world, then it's personally, it's difficult to see why or question why I'm doing it. So that's always something in the back of my mind, is to think, right, how could this improve actual practice, applied practice?
And just sort of in a nutshell, in terms of, for our listeners, we've sort of touched on your research, just to give us, I know it's difficult in the short time we have, and I'm sure you help people in various ways you've mentioned earlier, but as a general sort of, the cognition, the thought process point of view, do you sort of work closely with the athlete? Are you with them while they participate, or do they sort of log it down? How does that generally work in terms of, let's say, for example, if I was an athlete looking for some help to improve my performance in sport, let's say football, for example, maybe I had an issue taking a penalty, what would the process be, just in a nutshell, Amy?
Yeah, it's very dependent on like kind of how you want it to work. But if I was working with you as your sports psychologist, then we might meet and discuss some of your potential, like what you see as your issues or areas that you need support with. And then as a sports psychologist, we might employ a range of different kind of needs analysis tools, observation. I might come and talk to your coach. We'll get an insight from you. And kind of build up a bit of a case formulation to understand you more and how I could potentially help you. From a think aloud perspective, if you came to me as a golfer and you kind of said, I need help to understand my cognitions and how I can improve performance, then I might give you a clip mic and a dictaphone and ask you to go and play around the golf and verbalise your thoughts and then send it to me so I can listen back. Kind of identify some areas that maybe I think that where you might need support, and then we can sit down together and go through that, kind of interrogate your thought process as you're performing, and then we can look at identifying certain areas where you might need support and then implement different types of interventions.
Yeah, no, that's interesting stuff. And is there like an age where, obviously there's different rules and regulations in terms of age, but in terms of, say, like age-wise, is there a point you think what age can one sort of begin to sort of implement this sort of strategy? Sort of my thoughts are, as an athlete, for example, the younger you can get into the right mindset, the better. But do you ever look like an age that you generally work with in terms of what's the sort of youngest you would work with, Amy?
That's a great question, and I've never really thought about that.
On the spot.
I've worked with athletes as young as kind of 14, 15. Yeah. And obviously the work we do will be different to the work I might do with an adult. But I think you're right in that being able to develop that kind of the right mindset at a young age is really important. Yeah. So I would work more so with a coach maybe at that age,
yes, of course,
at a younger age, because I think they're the most integral piece of the puzzle to help develop that that right mindset. That's from a great point. Age.
I was just thinking like the brain being malleable, and obviously the younger you get into that sort of mindset, then great. But like you said, I think that's really interesting point there. And just sort of finally on sort of, you mentioned that you work with a coach. Do you actually work with coaches too, in terms of, I know you do the work with athletes, but obviously coaching is can be a lonely field really. You're out there, you're there for everybody else, but no doubt coaches have their sort of moments as well. They've got to make these big decisions, and we've seen in the media coaches have to sort of send players home and things go on, and you've got to make big calls really. Do you ever find yourself in situations where a coach might sort of, or would you be open to working with coaches too?
Yeah, definitely. I think working with coaches is one of the biggest, it's quite a rewarding process, because you're helping one person that can then help a whole team. So I have worked for a football club in the past where I did spend probably the majority of the time supporting the manager and the coach with things like how to articulate, team talks, how to support certain players in certain ways, and then also just kind of being a sounding board for some managers in terms of, certain players, their thoughts on, different players, and kind of how to manage certain players in different ways. So yeah, I do think that I really enjoy working with the coach.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of one area that I've worked in and around. And then from a think aloud perspective, I've worked a lot with coaches where we mic coaches up and get them to verbalise kind of what they're thinking as a coaching and reflecting on that where possible to help them with their development, so their self-reflection process.
No, that's really interesting stuff. I think that's really fascinating because, you know, there's coaches up and down, you know, the country, and many coaches listening, and obviously at different levels too. You know, some coach recreationally, some coach semi-pro, some coach professionally. But we all want to improve and be the best we can if you in any profession really. But in terms of you sort of, is there any way people can sort of, you mentioned the work that you do, the think aloud. Do you have any sort of details possibly people can sort of have a look and see more around your work that you could share? Amy, is there anything you sort of share for our listeners here?
No problem. So anyone can kind of, if you Google Amy Whitehead LGMU, then you've got my work LGMU profile and all like my research papers and my work is on there. There are some blogs that I've done more recently for the British Psychology Society, which are readily available if you just stick Think Aloud and BPS into Google. And there will be some resources from UK coaching coming out over the next kind of 6 months around what is Think Aloud and how can coaches use it. But apart from that, if anyone wants to just drop me an email at a.e.whitehead@lgmu.ac.uk, and I am happy to answer questions or share additional research.
No, fantastic, Amy. It's been really fascinating. No doubt our listeners have sort of really been intrigued about your work, and certainly they've got the details there. They can look into it even more. So we want to really thank you for coming on board the show. It's been a fascinating insight into your work, and we've only sort of scratched the surface, really. I'm sure there's a lot more to it than that. That was Dr. Amy Whitehead, Reader of Sports Psychology and Coaching at Liverpool John Moores, who's given us a really interesting insight into her work, and I certainly would sort of recommend following the links and looking into more of what she does. So thank you, Amy. Great to have you on board.
Thanks so much, Jimmy. It's great to chat to you.